And welcome to day 3 of our Patton College Beginner Series. We're going to get started. Again, if you weren't here earlier, the slides are in the chat if you'd like to take a look and download those for yourself. If you can't see the chat for some reason, just let me know, and after I get the day rolling, I will get those out to you. We are here, Meg and I again, so Dr. Meg Flanagan, and I am Jody Monk from the Office of Instructional Innovation. We also have Lindsay Rudabaugh with us. She is in the undergraduate experiential learning area, and she's going to talk a little bit about authentic assessment and experiential learning with us today, here in a minute. So welcome, and as usual, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. If you have a burning question that really needs to be answered immediately, or you have a thought or want to contribute, you can always use the raise your hand option, which is in the more actions area on Teams, and one of us will get to you, and we can discuss whatever comes to mind. So for those of you who haven't been with us the past 2 days, this is day 3, so we may touch on some topics that we talked about in the earlier sessions. So day 1, we talked about writing course outcomes, and we touched on backward design and alignment. Day 2, we dug deeper into backward design and kind of scaffolding out and planning your course. And we gave you all a course map template that you may or may not want to use when you're building your course. And today we are going to talk about a couple different things, but focus on authentic assessment. So Lindsay's going to jump on here in a moment and talk about experiential learning and just kind of give us an overview. We'll dig into what authentic assessment actually is and what it means. We'll provide you guys with some different examples, and then finally we'll wrap up with authentic assessments kind of in that experiential context. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Lindsay Rudabaugh for a few minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And Jody and Meg, thank you for letting me also be here and do this. So I represent the Undergraduate Experiential Learning Office, and I've been at Ohio University for about a little over a year, and I come from a background, I was a high school teacher for a little while, and then I made the switch to higher education in 2010, and I have been working in study away and experiential settings for most of my career. So experiential learning as a process is something that I believe wholeheartedly in. You know, research shows that students who participate in experiential settings are more likely to graduate. They can see the connections between what they're learning and their and why it matters really more clearly. They can justify the need for education more clearly to, you know, family members or friends or so on who might ask the value, etc. So experiential learning is at Ohio University was just recently defined by UCC in 2018, and I'm going to talk about that definition a bit here, but I want to talk about two things in the Ohio University curriculum that have really pushed experiential learning to the forefront, and that is the Guarantee Plus process that was just recently very quickly pushed through. Guarantee Plus, if we do it the way we've said we're going to do it, students along their pathways will have 3 to 4 experiential learning opportunities. Also, in addition to that, we've just approved the new general education curriculum, the BRICS curriculum. And so starting in fall of 2021, students will be in their gen ed curriculum, and experiential learning opportunity will be included. So every student will be required to do something in experiential learning. So what does that mean exactly? So we've talked about 6 different categories. So it could be Community engagement, it could be creative activity or research. It could be study abroad or study away. That could be a leadership opportunity, like being in student senate, etc. A deeply engaged leadership opportunity. That could be an internship. So that's sort of the gamut that we're talking about. But that also can show up in a variety of, like in individual classrooms and a variety of activities. So my goal in my office is to expand access to experiential learning because I think it's really valuable, but also because the university has made these curricular shifts that says more students need access to these opportunities. So that's the lens I come from. And then what you see here on this slide is essentially the definition that the university has put forth. So with my own twists to some degree. So nationally, it's sort of agreed that experiential learning is a cycle, and it starts with what I call preflection. This is pre-reflection, so planning, predicting what might happen when you have the actual experience, the action piece. So preflection is really just adequate preparation to take action. Then we take action, we reflect on that action. How could we have made it better? What would I do differently? And then we take action again. And then the cycle repeats. So preflection and reflection, I would argue, are that's the bedrock of experiential learning. It's one thing to go, and this is an example I cite often, but if I travel to Costa Rica and I see baby sea turtles who are hatched and released by biologists, and I take cool pictures and I post that to Instagram, I've had a cool experience, but I haven't necessarily learned experientially. So to bookend that, I might research before I go to Costa Rica what is endangering baby sea turtles or sea turtles generally, and then figure out what I can do or not do to protect the sea turtles. So that would be a more robust learning experience. So that's the cycle. And then our definition here at OU says, when done best, these 5 conditions exist. So engagement is deep engagement, meaning that the students don't just spend surface level time or surface level thought even, discussion around an experience. They engage deeply. That might be immersive, spend one intense week, or that could be sustained over a 15-week period or a year-long engagement. Mentorship, meaning that there's someone who is probably paid by the university who is there to facilitate that reflection process. Mentorship can come in a lot of different forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be faculty. That could be a GA. That could be an internship site supervisor, etc. And then challenge is defined as novelty. So if I have an experience that I've been having a lot for years, then the challenge level for me is not super high. So challenge is pushing the students to do new things and learn new things. Then ownership is this idea that students there's some level of decision making and self-directedness for the students. And then the last piece here, I would argue that self and social awareness is actually an outcome of experiential learning. If it's done well, then students have a heightened sense of self and social awareness. The last piece, this is my own addition, but it seems really germane to our conversation today. But when done best, experiential learning happens in an authentic context, pushing us outside of the traditional classroom space, pushing students to engage with their own communities. In a virtual setting, I would say that students' own homes and home communities become the learning laboratory. If we think about that as not as a deficit, but as a new opportunity, then authentic context exists around us for nearly every discipline. There might be a few where I can't find authentic context for aeronautics in my backyard, but most disciplines exist in most communities. So that is the full cycle, and that is all I will say for the moment, unless there are comments or questions. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and so this is Meg now, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about what do we really mean by authentic assessment. What does that look like? How is that different from traditional types of assessments? And why might it be worth considering doing it? And one of the reasons that we feel is important that we consider doing authentic assessments is that they are great not just at assessing learning and helping us give grades to our students for the work that they've completed, but also it helps them to improve and deepen what otherwise might have been simply a theoretical understanding of course content. And also then that's because our authentic assessments require application of that knowledge and skills that we're introducing them to in the classroom to real life kind of complex, messy situations. And of course, we're always thinking about, well, why are we having them do these tasks? And everything always ties back to our learning outcomes, those course outcomes that we thought about at the very beginning of this series. What kinds of skills and content knowledge do we want our students to have achieved by the time they finished the courses? And of course, these authentic assessments, we can tie them very nicely into these outcomes that we've been building up throughout the semester. And so because these are real world situations and they're messy and complicated, they're going to require judgment and sometimes innovation from our students that we can't always easily build into a traditional type of test, because we're asking the student to live the experience. We're actually asking them to do the subject that is coming up. And then I think we need some more bullets. Yes, thank you, Jodie. And then importantly, it really allows our students not to engage in one and done types of assessments, but instead, because of the iterative nature of these assignments, as Lindsay referred to there, the students are getting a lot of opportunity to practice, to consult resources and get feedback and work towards refining whatever that product might be. And we'll talk more about examples of what we mean by product. We're thinking about the kinds of assignments and what the students will produce at the end of that. So why we should think about using authentic assessment is because it really taps into student motivation. And as we know, there are multiple dimensions of motivation. And an important one, of course, is that we know that students will stick with something if they either feel competent or they can see their competency growing.
Into your folder.
I hit OK to accept it.
I think somebody might have their microphone unmuted, so, and I've done that. So if you could just make sure that your microphones are muted, that would be great. Thank you very much. It's such a weird world that we're inhabiting at the moment. And we're all getting interrupted and phones ring, and my dogs will probably come in here at any moment and bark. So I'm going to apologize for that in advance. But just to tie back to what we were saying, we know students will stick with things if they feel that they are competent to do it, or importantly, if they can see that they are developing a growing competency with the material. And in authentic assessments, the students have a very important feeling of control and autonomy, in that they have a certain amount of control about how they would go about doing a task, and they can see a direct link between their choices and their actions, and how things eventually turn out. And of course, that all feeds into our great big meta goals that we always have for our students, of encouraging self-directed learning. So that's a really important goal that keeps the students motivated. And of course, again, as Lindsay referred to, there's a growing sense of relatedness, not just between the theory of what we're introducing in the classroom and the practice, but depending on the kinds of tasks that we're having our students do, there's also a developing sense of connectedness with social groups, whether that be their peers, professionals in the industry, or the community at large. And then last but not least, we know that students really will stick with things that are difficult when they see its worth, when they can place a value on it. And that, for all of us, we're all exactly the same. That will always raise our enthusiasm for sticking with things when they're difficult and seeing them through to completion when we know that it's valuable to us. And we think that the research shows that authentic assessments really tap into all of these different dimensions of motivation for our students. And so these next 3 slides are actually, I'm not going to go through them step by step, because you can look at these at your leisure when you have the time to think it through, but just give you the key bullet points from these. So we're comparing the major differences between what we might think of as a typical test, like a multiple choice test or an essay of some kind, and how that might differ from an authentic task. And so certainly in my class, we often, our typical tests, there are right and wrong answers. And certainly in my field, which is physiology, even though there isn't always immediately a correct response, there is almost always a wrong response. And so the differences with that and an authentic task is because authentic tasks are based in the real world, there's often not a clear-cut right and wrong answer to these. And so the task is more involved with the students thinking through these nuanced, complex issues and justifying why they chose to do one thing or another. Again, really speaking to the kinds of things that we do on a daily basis. And unlike a typical test where we don't let the students know in advance what's coming up because we're afraid they might cheat, etc., an authentic task, as we all know, when we're asked to do something, we know what the criteria are. We know exactly what's expected and how, what kinds of different dimensions we need to include when we are carrying out this particular task. And in authentic assessments, we are sharing that information with our students up front so that nothing is a surprise when they're being graded. And typical tests, certainly not always, but sometimes, maybe even lots of the time, they're kind of disconnected from the real world constraints that we would face. In my physiology classes, we'll give examples of students, of patients who have these particular parameters. And when they have all of these parameters, that indicates that they have this wrong with them. And we're always saying to them, you know, in the real world, there is no such thing as the textbook patient. But it's hard for them to see that when they're working through textbook examples. Whereas in real life, again, because they're tied to real world constraints and we're having students do things, they immediately see what those constraints are and they learn how to think about them like professionals. And typical tests, again, not always, but often are quite discrete. They're testing particular skill sets as we're moving, or content areas as we're moving through the curriculum. Whereas in authentic tasks, we're integrating these different types of content and skills and using them in more than one way as they're working through these challenges. And then finally, typical tests, because there are right and wrong answers, they're often quite easy to score. And of course, with anything that we do that is complex and valuable for our students, that means it's quite a lot of work for us. But it's worth it because of all the many reasons that we're just talking about. But why it's more complex is because up front, we're having to think about how we're going to grade that. What are the really important things that we need to see our students do? And how are we going to present that in some kind of a rubric or something that helps the students see what's being requested of them? And then how are we going to give them feedback as they're working their way towards this competency? So it's certainly not an easy thing to do, but, you know, as my Irish granny would say, things that are difficult are or things that are important are very seldom easy. And so, again, the difference between typical tests, I think I referred to this before, it's often a one and done kind of chance to show what they know. These authentic tasks are iterative. And the students are using their skills and knowledge in more than one way. And as I said at the very beginning, at the end, when they have this authentic assessment, they're not just getting a score, they're not just getting, you got 88% on this exam, but because of the way that we set the task up, because of the way that we have shared what the criteria are, and that we've been working with them, giving them feedback, they have a very clear understanding of what they can do well and what needs work. And so it's it's always a learning tool, even if it's an assessment that is in some ways summative for that course. So very, very valuable. And so what we thought would be useful to do now is I'm going to pass this over to Jodie to just give some examples of what that might look like broadly in certain disciplines, and then we're going to hand it back to Lindsay to actually work through some experiential authentic assessments. So Jodie, over to you.
All right. Ooh, thought those would come in.
Oh, now we've lost your
there we go, back.
There.
There we go. Now they're coming in one at a time. My PowerPoint jumped on me. So we're going to walk through a couple examples, and I'm as an instructional designer, oftentimes I work with faculty transitioning assessments and courses to the online environment. So I'll try with some of these to talk through how it might look face-to-face and how you could potentially transition this to the online setting. And as we said in the last couple sessions, when you're planning your course, always plan for what you think would be your perfect class, right? If you had no constraints, how would you run an assessment? How would you run your course? And then if you are transitioning to online, someone from our office can help you really think through what that would look like and how that can be built and what tool to pick. But we still really want to work towards the best expression of that learning outcome you've developed, and then find a way to either do it face-to-face or do it in the online environment, or potentially this fall in a blended way. So, but remember, when you're planning, always try to plan for your perfect class the way you'd absolutely want to do it. And I'll give you an example, a bigger example here in a few minutes of how I worked with one faculty to move a larger project. They always did face-to-face online in an authentic way still. So in nursing, you might be giving students case studies and have them assess and create a plan of care. So maybe in class, you would put students in groups and you'd hand out different case studies, and you'd have each group kind of work through different criteria for that plan of care and how they'd go about doing that. Again, it's authentic, right? It's what they may be doing in the field later on. If you have access, you can pull true patient cases so that it is tied to an actual event. And, you know, this can be done online as well. So online, we can put students in groups. We can ask them to meet synchronously outside of class and use technology that's comfortable for them, or we can give them a space maybe in Microsoft Teams or in the Blackboard Groups tool to work and collaborate to come up with the outcome you are hoping. So business. We might ask our students to develop a business, marketing, or sales plan for a real company or a made-up company. I know here on campus, our business school does a lot of things like this. And again, this could be an individual project where students start off the semester maybe learning about sales plans and how to pitch a sales plan to someone. And then they move into groups and start doing some more development and basic work in that area. And then finally, after you've scaffolded that basic information and knowledge they need to create one of these plans, you move to the final step where they do that. And again, to make it as authentic as possible, it would be neat if you could, like Lindsay said, work with the community to maybe pull in some businesses that are in need of support of the development of a sales plan of this nature to make it truly authentic to the students and the community where they're working. Here's another one for computer science. So if you're troubleshooting some problematic code or making a website, so computer science and any of the tech fields obviously translate pretty seamlessly to the online world, assuming your students have access to the right technology. So something like this may work well. I know there's a lot of websites out there that have coding problems built in that you could pull from, right? So it's not always building something yourself, but sometimes it's curating the right type of assessment for students that make it feel authentic. And a lot of times in computer science and business and nursing, all of these worlds, you're working in teams. So anytime you can have students work together and identify different roles that they might play, or have them check one another, kind of like they might do in the real world, it's a good way to tie in that authentic nature. There we go. So psychology, you may do more case studies, and case studies are, in my opinion, a fun thing to pull online because we have some great tools here at OU that allow students to engage asynchronously, but still get a feel for the synchronous environment. So with this one, you might, in the classroom, have everyone break into teams, and each team kind of identifies a different theoretical position and examines a case study. And online, you can do something similar. So you might use VoiceThread and present the case study and have different groups of students examine different theoretical positions. So once everything's done, everyone can get in and kind of look through what's happened. Just as in the class, you might have each group present out about what they came up with. But a lot of these things can be translated. They just look and feel different when you get to the online space. Public affairs. So again, this would be kind of like the business example, considering how an agency might be impacted by a challenge. So giving students a scenario-based approach where they have to, as a group or individuals, look at these different pieces of the challenge and kind of come up with what they feel might be the best solution or plan moving forward. And again, a lot of this would likely be scaffolded throughout your course. So you're not just presenting this assignment and saying, okay, here's a challenge date, week 2 of class, you need to do all these things. So week 1, you might talk about impact of budget, and week 2 you might talk about impact in community relations, and building up these smaller skill sets so that when you provide students with a larger simulation piece, they have all those pieces in place that they've learned and been formatively assessed on and provided feedback so that they can attack the problem or the case study or whatever it might be in a way that's appropriate to their field. Again, with biology or chemistry, you could give them a process and what happens if X occurs, so they have to work through and determine the outcome. Similarly, this can be done online. I know a lot of times online with math and writing up equations and things, it can get hard when you're submitting assignments. And many faculty I've worked with have just had students handwrite equations, right? So it doesn't always have to be typed up or designed digitally for the online space. Things like this can also be worked on a collaborative whiteboard. So maybe you have a group of students who are working through it together, and you can give them a collaborative whiteboard space to work and consult together. Or if it's an individual project, because maybe it's the type of thing someone would do, you know, individually, they can just write it out on paper, snap a picture, or scan it and submit it to you that way. And finally, a role play. So role plays are fun. I'm guessing if many of you are in education, this happens a lot, where you may want to have a person act out that they're teaching a class or that they're in a certain situation. And I like this one because what would have changed if a historical event had changed, right? So that makes students not just act out something they know that happened, like a play, but it makes them kind of analyze the situation and look at the factors and how each component might be changed by one change in history. So anytime, you know, if you're having trouble thinking about these authentic assessments, it's always really great, as Meg said, to go back to your course outcomes. So if you can loop back to your course outcomes and say, what do I really need students to be able to do? Or what is the goal for them to be able to accomplish at the end of that class? It'll help you think about and design a more authentic assessment for your students. All right, so I'm going to talk to you. I worked with the public administration program, helping them design some courses a while back. And one of the faculty I was working with had this project they love to do face-to-face. It was their favorite project. All the students loved it. And when I sat down with her, she said, you know, I just don't think we can do it online. And I said, well, let's talk about it. Let's see what we can do. So we started with the outcome, and the outcome was develop fundraising skills and strategies required of nonprofit practitioners in the acquisition of resources essential to nonprofit survival. So it's a big wordy outcome, and it covers a lot of things. And throughout the course, up to this point where we started to cover this outcome, students had already been doing some of these pieces. So they had been learning about mission statements of nonprofit organizations and learning about different types of donors and why people give money and all these little pieces that built up to this learning outcome that happened a little bit later in the course. So there were also module level outcomes that went with this course level outcome, which I don't have written, but I'll kind of paraphrase them for you. So students needed to name key reasons people give money, target fundraising in ways that appeal to donors' interests, meeting organizational needs, practice asking for money, and identify key takeaways and advice for working in a nonprofit in this way. So they had this big outcome, like we asked you to do. She broke it into module level outcomes, so the small pieces necessary. And what she wanted to do in the face-to-face setting was, or what she always did in the face-to-face setting, was have a role play. So students were in small groups and they had to come up with a scenario. So she didn't give them the scenario, it was on them to create the scenario, but in a very structured way. So this is what we ended up doing online, but it did mirror what happened face-to-face, and it did go really well, and she had the same, her students continued to meet the outcome, and she said, you know, we always have those goals that aren't really tied to the course, but are what we hope for, and you know, the students kind of seeing that light bulb go off, and she said they all had that same moment, or not all, but most of them had that same connection as she felt in the classroom. So she was really pleased with how it went. But students still, just like in the face-to-face class, carried out a simulation or role play. But here's where it really hits that course outcome. So they had to either do a solicitation interview for a major gift, planned gift, or capital campaign gift. And it had to have this contextual information, which tied back in a lot of the learning they had done earlier in the class. The role or identity of each participant, the location and organization, a response, and a follow-up. And they really needed to tie in why they were asking for money for that specific person with the mission of the nonprofit that they created in this simulation. So it was asking them to do a lot of this thinking and planning, and in Lindsay's terms, kind of like the pre-flexion before their role play actually happened. And they had to develop it and design it, keeping all of those things in mind that they had learned throughout the course. So she gave some examples for students, and I said, well, do you need to give them specific tasks? And she said, I've done it in the past. I never gave them specifics, and everyone's always come up with something great. So we stuck with that. And oftentimes online, we'll try to put a little bit more constraint around things just to limit the questions and uncertainty online. But this worked really well in this instance. So they had to work together, how much to ask for, what period of time, the rationale for that person being asked. And you can see here, this means that you'll need to link donor intent with organizational goals and opportunities. So that's scaffolded information they had already learned and were implementing in this ask for money. And then they had to have a response. So it didn't have to be a yes, we'll give you your money, although she said that typically all their asks got the money they asked for, but a no would be okay as well. But the justification had to be there as to why, right? So they recorded it, and this was before, we set this up before we had Teams on campus. So all the students, we gave them a little bit of technology scaffolding and taught them how to use Zoom. And earlier in the class, we had them record a Zoom video for their introduction. So they had already learned about that technology use ahead of time, as well as the tools to complete the assigned task. And then they had to post it to VoiceThread. So VoiceThread, for those of you who don't know, is a tool that allows you to kind of do, it's like a discussion kind of, but people can post video, audio, text, you can post documents. It does a lot more than a discussion board might, and it kind of makes an asynchronous environment feel a little bit synchronous. So they posted them to VoiceThread. Again, more technology scaffolding. So we had used VoiceThread in the past. And then they had to respond to their peers and give some feedback. And she also scaffolded giving feedback. So in past experiences, they had to give feedback to students and practice giving good feedback. And then they had to watch that feedback and respond in a discussion board, responding to the feedback, and then citing their key takeaways and advice they might give to someone doing this in the future. There was a note, as you know, anything like this, the students were not getting graded on their acting. And she also gave guidance on the feedback that was given, that it shouldn't be on the acting or the technology use, but on the outcome that they were aiming for. So this all tied up into a cumulative project. So the artifact here listed is just what went in the final compilation of work for the course to show that they had met all of the learning outcomes. So just to review, because that was a lot of words on one page, so I apologize. Here is the outcome she was aiming for. And what she was actually asking students to do was plan, which is a big important piece of it, so that pre-flexion and pre-thought before going into it, and carry out a simulation or role play. She then had students take it a step further and observe others completing this same type of role play and offer feedback. So not just doing it themselves, but seeing other people do it and thinking critically and providing that feedback on what may have gone better and what they did well. Then students had to take in that feedback and listen to it and digest it. And finally, they had to respond. So they had to reflect themselves. This is kind of that final step. So takeaways they learned from the exercise and advice they might give someone moving forward. So looking internally and then externally as advice you might give for others. So it was a huge project, and all of the information that students used had been scaffolded up to this point where they had the big ask. I think this was about halfway through the course, and there were a number of other projects like this that all kind of built upon one another. But it was a really fun way for students to practice. They had some low stakes activities, learning about the other concepts, but this was high stakes. So this was the point they had to show what they had learned. And likely many of them in the nonprofit world will have to engage in asking for money or work with people who are asking for money for their organization. So it was extremely related to future tasks that they would likely have to be doing. All right, so there are some examples. I'm assuming you all have some excellent examples of things you've done in the past. And if we have time at the end, we might be able to talk through some of those or take questions. But I am going to hand the mic back over to Lindsay, who is going to talk about authentic assessment in more experiential contexts.
Thanks, Jody. So before I do that, I want to just pose a question to the group. And we don't have to answer this, but I want you to have an answer in your own mind. So what are some things that you know you should do but don't do? What should you do but choose not to? So some things that come to my mind are not eat sugar. I know that I should not eat sugar, but I do it. So that's perhaps the inverse of the question. But I also know that I should work out more regularly, and I often, like this morning, chose to sleep in instead of do yoga, etc. Right? There are lots of things that we know about that we choose not to take action on. And so knowledge doesn't automatically transfer to doing. Knowing isn't doing, as one of my a climate scientist that I respect is often quoted as saying. He wrote a book on climate change in the 80s and said, I answered all of the questions, and I believed that people would read the book, and then I had saved the world because now knowledge is power, but it doesn't automatically transfer to action. So experience, more so than simple knowledge, catalyzes change. And if we want our students to develop skills to change, if we want them to develop also dispositions, change dispositions, then experience is the strongest way, the most direct route toward that. Ohio University has on the gateway up in College Green, something that I've internalized, and I'm paraphrasing, but it says, enter that thou may grow in knowledge, wisdom, and love. And so for my own purposes, I have looked at that to mean that knowledge, we want to grow in knowledge, sure, but we also want the wisdom to be able to transform that knowledge into action. And the more experiences that we have and the more we engage with different perspectives, the more we grow in love, in compassion, and empathy. So that's just my one more plug for the value of experiential learning. So Jody, you can go ahead and we'll talk about reflective assessment. And you can go ahead and put all three up there, Jody. Thank you. So when you're planning a course, a full learning experience, so from beginning to end, the reflective, the preflective pieces are super important. So you can do this. These three things you see here are options on a menu, I would say, that can be used together, can be used individually, but these create the scaffolding for how you guide reflection in your courses. So, for example, individual processing might be most appropriate immediately after an experience to give students the opportunity to figure out how they feel about something before they have to articulate that to someone else. There is inherent vulnerability in trying new things. And so to let students sort of sit with it before they're put on the spot to talk about it in a group setting might be best. But if we jump down to pre, during, and post, that idea of pre-reflection might be just fine to do in a group setting. So if you're going to, for example, as a class, do a project with PassionWorks or Rural Action, that pre-reflection activity might be to talk about the mission of that organization, talk about the challenges of the organization, why they are in operation. So students have some context before they just jump right into action. The third listing there is experiential to disciplinary to interdisciplinary. So this might be similar to the individual processing to group processing trajectory, where students often, when we have an experience, we react with our senses first. So we could ask students questions about their sensory experience. What did you see and feel and hear and so on. And so students usually connect new experiences to old experiences. Like, does this fit in a box that I already have in my mind? Or does it totally break the mold? And then we can move from students' personal reactions and responses from that experiential spot to a disciplinary connection. How does this experience relate to my own discipline or the content of this class? And then if we're really skilled, we can push students to think about the experience from an interdisciplinary perspective. So right now, I would say the most profound example is what we're all living, COVID-19. So for students to talk about how it's impacted their own lives could be very interesting, and they could find connection points across their own experiences there. What it's been like to be physically distanced and so on. But if I am a public health major, the connection between COVID-19 and my own discipline is very, very obvious. But if I'm a fine arts major, perhaps the public health major doesn't see how it's also impacting fine arts. But the closure of the many spaces where we appreciate fine arts and the reaction that often happens in the artist community to really disruptive events. Or catastrophic events. There's usually a response in the art world. So as we build reflective assessments or plans for our semesters, we can look at all three of these categories as options for scaffolding the reflective assignments and activities that we do. And Jody, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, yes, perfect. So yeah, you can go back there. The through line of all of this is what Ohio University has agreed is the outcome of experiential learning is self and social awareness. So processing individually, processing before an experience, processing in terms of my own individual experience, my sensory experience, that's raising self-awareness. And then moving to the disciplinary and the interdisciplinary value of an experience can help us raise social awareness. So that's the through line in all of reflection. So negotiating grading, and Jody, you can go ahead and put up all of the pieces here. Thank you. So I hope that this is something that we can have some discussion about, but this is an example of assessment that I carried out throughout the entirety of a few courses I taught. So I'll explain like the nuts and bolts of what it looked like. But I will say that this is in all of the classrooms I've been in, this was the thing that finally enabled me to change students' focus from memorization or regurgitation or knowledge in the moment and shifted that focus to continuous improvement, which I think is the attitude we need if we want our students to be lifelong learners and to see education as a process a journey, not merely an endpoint, a grade and done. So I'll also acknowledge at the beginning here that this is a high lift process, but I'll just walk you through what I did in some of my classes. So to start, in my syllabus, I offered 2 different grading systems to the students. I said we can do traditional point-based grades, or we can do this what I called negotiated grading. I used to call it contract grading, but that didn't really capture it. So the students opted in. I would explain what it looked like, and then I would leave the room. They would discuss and decide, and then let me know when I came back into the room if we were doing points-based or negotiated grades. And I did this 4 times, and all 4 times the students chose negotiated grading. And all 4 times at the end, I asked if they had preferred we would have done point-based or if they preferred that we do negotiated. And in all 4 cases, they said that they were happy they did negotiated grading. So what is it? Well, what I did is I created a spreadsheet, and this was a leadership. I did this actually in a Spanish class. That's my background. I teach or taught Spanish. And then I did it in a leadership class. I also taught in our leadership minor at my previous institution. So in the leadership class, I created a spreadsheet, and down the side, I listed all of the major course activities, like projects and assignments, but also major course concepts. And then we would meet. I would meet individually, so this is where the high lift comes in, every 3 to 5 weeks with the students, one-on-one. And in that first meeting, they would come in with their chart filled out. Like, I think I deserve an A for course concept number 1, but I think I'm at a B. I have some room, a little bit of room to grow, but I'm pretty good at course concept number 2. And we would do that. The spreadsheet over the course of the semester would grow as we added more concepts and more activities. And they would come in with their arguments. I would, having given feedback on their assignments as we went, in those conversations, I would say, well, I agree or disagree, and have you thought about this? But the most important thing that I did in those conversations was ask them to apply their learning. In what ways have you applied this idea to your own life or in another class, or have you found connections to other classes? And so in that first meeting, typically the students would come in with really high ranks for themselves because, that's what they think they're supposed to be doing, is arguing that they are doing a great job and deserve an A. And then in the second conversation, usually their own self-evaluation dropped. I would see a lot of C's, even some D's, lots of B's. And they would say, well, I realized that actually I thought I was applying it, but I just applied it for the first time today. Or, in the last few weeks, I've realized that I have a lot more opportunities to apply that than I had been taking advantage of. So it pushed the students to think about their own learning more deeply and recognize where they weren't using it, where they weren't turning knowledge into action. And then at the end, the class as a group would decide what weight should be given in final grades to different course concepts and activities. So if a project took 3 weeks, they would give that higher weight. Or if a particular idea they felt was something they should definitely not leave the class without learning, they would say that and agree upon that. And I was always really delighted that individually a student might not agree, might not come to the same conclusions that I'd want them to about what was most important from the class. But after group discussion, they usually arrived at the same conclusions that I was hoping they would, that concepts XYZ were, the most important things. So we would give that a weight. And so in the end, the math, and I can share this spreadsheet, and I would love to work through this with anyone who's interested in doing it or has done it and, could provide me some tips. But in the end, it still came down to a grade that was sort of numerically settled on, but it was an iterative process to get there. So the goal is measuring growth over time, not knowledge in a specific moment. And the feedback I got in course evaluations was that the students thought they were more likely to keep using that learning because they knew how, and they, in their own brains, had decided on the value of it. So I'd love to talk more about negotiated grading. This has always been contentious when I was doing it, and I first said it to my supervisor that I wanted to try it. She said, "You can't make it mandatory." So that's when we started to let students opt in or not, and they always did. I'm sure if I did it many more times, at some point, students would say, "No, thank you. Let's do point-based." But it's delighted with the ones who didn't. Okay, Jody, I think we can go on. Thank you. All right, so low stakes simulation to high stakes action. This was my way of saying that sometimes preflection can come in the form of uncritical action, right? Like, we want to be really careful about planning and thinking and predicting, but sometimes the best teacher is the bad experience. So what I have done in some cases is build in failure by telling the students with limited instruction to do something, and then let it sort of be messy and ugly, and then reflect on that messy, ugly thing to say, okay, how could you have done it differently? So an example in my leadership class was I gave the instructions, come to a consensus about how to make the perfect peanut butter and jelly. And I put them in pairs. So just among two people, they had to decide how to make the perfect peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But the most important thing was really not the sandwich, it was the process that they used to come to consensus. But I didn't tell them that. So then as a group of two, they settled on their answer. And then I said, okay, get together with a different, two partners, get together to form a group of four. And then slowly we'd have more discussion, they'd come to consensus, now a group of 8, and then the full class. And then we'd have this peanut butter and jelly sandwich full of compromise. And rather than ask them questions about their sandwich, I would say, how do you think, what was that process like? Was it frustrating? Was it easy? What if you were deciding on something more important than a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Would you have argued more firmly for your opinions? And so we would debrief on what went well, what didn't, and how could they improve if they were going to make a decision the next time. And then that was the way to introduce, in some cases, that's how I introduced whether or not they were going to do negotiated grading. So learn how to come to group decisions in a democratic, diplomatic fashion, and then make a high stakes decision. And we would use that so one of the pillars of experiential learning is some level of ownership or self-directedness. And so we would use this process that the students built early in the class to inform all of our decision making that impacted the full group. So you can do similar things in any other setting. Low stakes first, moving to higher stakes, but that low stakes can be fairly uncritical without a lot of prep. And that failure stings a little bit, or, raises emotions in the students of frustration, etc. And as long as it's low stakes and not harmful, then it can be a really good teaching catalyst. I think, Jody, we can move along. And that's all from me for the moment.
Thank you very much. Oh dear, I'm echoing. I hate hearing my own voice. I don't know what it is about a microphone. Suddenly I get a Scottish accent and I don't normally have one. So I think hopefully listening to Lindsay, you can see the real value and the real ways in which our students become engaged with their own learning in really meaningful ways. But then as faculty and instructors were sitting there thinking, oh gosh, now do I have to redo absolutely everything? And remembering, as both Jody showed in her example and Lindsay showed in hers, You can use formative assessments that are low stakes or no stakes other than participation grades that are building up towards these summative authentic assessments. Not absolutely every assignment and assessment that you do in your class has to be this big one. This is working up towards that summative part. And then I thought I would give you an example. So for in my class, the physiology class, perhaps I want my final authentic assessment to have the students actually provide me a case study, actually write a case study rather than dissect the case study. And what I can do on the way there is the next bullet point is you can give low stakes assessment throughout the course. They're actually testing those lower level Bloom's types of skills, because before you can provide a case study on a particular disease, you need to know your facts, you need to understand them, you need to show that you know when to apply them, you need to be able to write the case study in such a way that it can be analysed and then evaluated with some kind of plan. And so you can test those lower level Blooms of the basic remembering and understanding as you're working up throughout the course towards this final assessment. And then finally, and we think it's important to say this, that having really emphasized the worth of all of these incredible authentic experiences for our students, sometimes we actually have to stick with our traditional inauthentic assessments, at least in some parts of the course. And again, in my case, I couldn't have all of my students really do proper authentic assessment of cases, because that's what medical school's for. Only when you're finished with your medical degree are you actually ready to do that kind of stuff. So I could do baby versions of that. But also, and importantly in my discipline, the way in which my students will get entry, or my old students, now I'm only with the medical students, but I used to also teach pre-professionals. And they hadn't yet taken their entrance exams, and their entrance exams were timed multiple choice tests, as are, believe it or not, board exams in medical school. So we don't want the very first time that our students are exposed to very high stakes issues in their discipline being that big high stakes moment, the pass or fail type of thing. So if you know what the requirements are in your discipline, you know what they might be for accreditation, for professional board exams, etc., etc. So if the traditional tests are important to help your students prepare for their next step, then it's important to still keep some of those too. And we're really ending with, it's authentic if it's true and valid to your discipline and your profession. So if you can, excuse me, I've got something stuck in my throat. If you can build in small types of authentic things, something is better than nothing, because hopefully you can see the value of doing it. But please don't feel that you have to throw out everything that you've been doing. So now we would really love to open up. I'm sure some of you have got, or hope some of you have got questions on the negotiated grading or any other part of this. We would be delighted to take questions from you. So you can either pop your question into the chat or raise your hand, or whatever is easier for you. No, it doesn't sound like anybody wants to share anything at the moment. So Jodie or Lindsay, would you? Oh no, here's something. Yay. I think that is.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Ashley, thank you.
No problem. Ashley Allenson from the Recreation Sport Pedagogy Department. Thanks for that presentation. And authentic assessment is something that I've been trying to implement quite often in the coaching world. Obviously, it's very practical. And we've had our own difficulties with COVID. But one of the things is more of a statement than a question. I don't know whether this can get pushed kind of to the higher echelons of the university. But you mentioned there that using an authentic assessment for a final is a really good way to kind of bring it in even as a summative assessment. And this is something that I'm trying to implement in a course that I'm delivering right now in our Masters in Coaching Education degree. And the issue that I have is that the course finishes on a Saturday and I'm getting them to do a voice for a presentation. And there's 37 students in my class right now. And all of a sudden, I've just received an email this morning that all grades need to be submitted by Wednesday, the 1st of July, which gives me a 4-day turnaround to grade these authentic assessments, which then becomes the balance of, well, the students get a lot out of it, but then the turnaround time for me to grade all of this is just ridiculous. And it's kind of like it pushes professors to basically do a multiple choice exam or test at the end of a semester because it's just easier to get your grades submitted. And that then becomes a problem because you want to kind of bring that whole summative aspect where they want to then show their knowledge of the whole course and not done in a kind of way of just ticking a box, i.e. multiple choice and do the revision for that, but make it authentic to what their experience will be and moving forward in that kind of lifelong learning that Lindsay mentioned. So that's kind of a gripe I have regarding the timing of implementing a final that has really, really huge benefits for the students on this authenticness, yet then we're pushed to not give us good feedback because we're trying to grade so many in such a short space of time.
I think you raise a really important point, and thank you for doing that. And I think that everything in the summer, because everything is so compressed and there's, everything has to be done faster. And there's that balance, as you say, about getting it done in a timely way, but actually getting it done in a meaningful way. And I am not entirely sure who we would feed that onto, but I definitely will find out and share that concern with whomever it's appropriate. I'm quite new here, but I know that my colleagues will know who the people are. And just to, if you would like to, if we could contact you later just to make sure we're accurately reflecting some of your concerns and just see if that's a consideration that can be, is there other exceptions? Could there be an extension on that, etc., etc.? I'm really not sure, but I think you've raised a very important point, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think when I do authentic assessments as a final in a 15-week course, and we might have a final on a Tuesday, for instance, which then gives you a little bit more lag time, and you've got like 6 or 7 days to do it, which is still ridiculously short, but then we can manage to kind of do it. When it's an online course, like the final's always going to be done on the last day of the course, which obviously in the 7 weeks is a Saturday. And then to have everything turned around, and I know it might only be summer, but to have everything turned around is just, and the email came today and it was quite shocking for me. I've been here 3 years and I know that we have these grade deadlines, but then everything that you've talked about in what we're trying to do for learner experience to improve it, for us to then kind of, it pushes us to make a decision to go against this because of grading deadlines, which is then that dilemma that you have every time you're creating a course and you're delivering a course.
Mm-hmm. No,
well, I appreciate
really,
that. Thank you.
Points. No, great points. Thank you.
I really appreciate that comment because I am looking for, and one of the questions that I ask as I've been getting to know people in this first year is, what are the barriers to actually doing experiential learning? Because I think there are a lot of people who are interested and have the skills, but choose not to. And those are the reasons that I want to root out. So you've pointed out one really important one. So thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Along with that, you make a good point that true authentic assessment does require some extra feedback. We've said it's an iterative process and it's important to reflect, but having that mentor piece to give feedback that's, from an expert perspective is really valuable to the students as well. So it's, like Ashley said, it's important to have enough time to give that feedback to make that experience even more authentic to the students.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, did you have a question?
Well, I work with Ashley, and I was just going to say he makes a valid point. And one thing we've been chatting about is where you integrate them. And one thing I've tried is trying to move the submission of expedite the learning portion of the class to give students time to do the authentic assessment. So a couple of things are, like this week I've got students submitting a session plan kind of a week early, and then I have like an extra time to grade. And what I'm going to do is with the students is engage them in a peer assessment process. And I don't know how that's going to go, and I'm going to learn some things from it, but we can do it that way. But like Ashley's saying, the problem is that you have to kind of take a week out of your class to kind of do that assessment. The only other thing is a bit like one of the presenters was saying, that you could, Margaret, so what you could do is have the authentic assessment like as the midpoint of the semester rather than the terminal assessment. Do you see what I mean? But the challenge with that is students might not have learned all the concepts you want them to learn to be able to do that kind of summative assessment. So again, another thing that I'm doing this week is, or next week, I've got students coming to a synchronous webinar to do presentations on a recovery periodization plan, and they will they'll do some peer assessment. But like I say, I have to do that kind of early in the week, and I couldn't do that assignment halfway through the course because students wouldn't have the prerequisite knowledge to look at recovery periodization in a holistic standpoint. So I completely agree with Ashley. And then my final point is, I think some of the tools you talked about are prohibitive as well. I think, personally, I found VoiceThread a little bit clunky because we have students in smaller group discussions, and you can't divide VoiceThread assignments into smaller group discussions. So you might, in our classes, we have large classes of like 70 to 100 students, and trying to manage a VoiceThread is just, well, it's unmanageable, right? So we have to do workarounds, like get them to post their VoiceThread link on a discussion board and then get them to feed back to each other through there. But some of the technologies are not the best either. And then the final thing is Blackboard in and of itself is extremely clunky, and that creates some challenges. So a lot of the challenges we face, yes, pertain to online environments, but I think that some of those things definitely need to be looked at as we move forward.
Yeah, you make a great point, and it is sometimes difficult to work within the parameters of those things. So it is true, it can be more difficult when you transition, especially doing groups on VoiceThread, and there are workarounds, but like you said, they're more burden on the faculty member to make it a good experience for the student.
Yeah, and I think one final thing, I read something the other week where they said if you're doing more work as the faculty member than the students are, then you're doing something wrong. Well, it was in a book about how learning happens by Paul Kirshner. Yeah. And I think you're right, there becomes an optimal point where if you're doing more than the students, you've got to start to question what it is that you're doing. We've started to sort of dial back a little bit on the number of assessments in order that we can do a better, more authentic assessment rather than 3 smaller assessments. And I think that's one way to overcome that challenge as well. And like Margaret said, I completely agree with her that some disciplines require you to do standardized tests. So I've moved to doing more quiz-based in small exams that test students' knowledge that way. that then creates space for me to do more like longer, authentic assessments. So I spend my time doing more grading and giving better feedback because I'm testing the students' higher knowledge, and I get them to do some of the lower knowledge through quizzes and exams. But that's just me and my discipline.
I think
Thank
these
you.
are all really great suggestions, though, and yeah, so thank you for sharing. I think these are all, it's always that balance of what do I want to do? What do I know that will look like? How do I know my students have achieved it? And then the big elephant in the room is how much time do I have? How much time do we have? And and we spoke about this, I'm not sure if you were with us earlier in the week, but thinking about those assignments, is important to consider the grading and how much work that's going to be, not just on the student, but on you as the faculty member. And probably most of us, certainly for me, I've gotten very enthusiastic over the years about particular things, and having my students do these great assignments, I thought, only to find that I never, I don't think I got a weekend off the entire semester because I had so much grading and feedback to do, because we also are of the school of thought that if you're going to give them something to do and you're going to grade it, that it's a learning opportunity. So you have to give timely feedback, which means you have to get it done in a few days. And yeah, so thinking about what you want to do, can you give them little scaffolded, small stakes, things that are building up to the occasional bigger one, but can you also give yourself enough time at the end of the semester to get it done? All very important in that course planning. And if anybody would like to reach out to either of us or any of your instructional designers as you're thinking through these types of things, that's something that we'd be happy to chat with you about, and just allow you to brainstorm and come up with some potentially different approaches to doing things. But I think your suggestions here are really valuable, and thank you for that.